Well, hello, everyone. A chilly Wednesday to all of you who are joining us for our midweek Bible study. Again, it's a cold day, but glad you are taking the time to either join live or listen to the recording later. And again, I'm just praying that you will find encouragement and just the joy in this study, maybe from a perspective that you maybe not had exposure to previously. So, as we pick up today, we are in Daniel chapter 5, picking up with verse 18. We're in the midst of a very dramatic scene where the king has been in the middle of a revelry, and the hand of God appeared and wrote some words on the wall, where we get the euphemism handwriting on the wall. And now we're going through the dissecting, unpacking of that as the king's advisors couldn't interpret it. The king's mother remembers a guy named Daniel. He's brought in, and this is where we pick up again. And of course, Daniel's been promised, many rewards. If he interprets this, he rejects them all and said, I will tell you what God has said. So here we pick up in verse 18. He says, Daniel speaking to the king, he says, "And O thou king, God most high has given Nebuchadnezzar your father the kingdom, the greatness, the glory, the majesty." He's rehearsing everything that this guy Belteshazzar should have known about what his father Nebuchadnezzar went through, and told him that God gave him all these things, gave him people and nations and languages, and that they trembled and feared before him. Sounds like he was a kind of a mean guy. Gives reference to that he had the power to kill them, those he would kill, those he would keep alive, those he would raise up, those he would put down. Sounds like a very hard, stern-handed dictator who didn't care anything about his subjects, but only wanted to portray himself in power and put down everyone who got in his way. And what's interesting, again, as I alluded to, is previously how God was in the life of Nebuchadnezzar while he was going through all of this. And we're going to see that he doesn't show the same favor to his son, who we're going to read about, the one who's the topic of this story right now. And I find that kind of interesting. So it says here, "But when Nebuchadnezzar's heart was lifted up, his spirit was hardened, and he was proud. Then he was disposed from his kingly throne, his glory taken from him." We read about the story where he was driven from men, and his heart was made like the beasts. His dwelling was in the wild. He ate grass. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, until his mind finally got straightened out, and he knew that God Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and that he sets it up over whomsoever he will. Again, fascinating topics in here to talk about. Just this part here about that God sets up kingdoms and gives it to whosoever he will. This is a challenging statement, especially when you think of um, kingdoms that have existed in the past. You think of Stalin, you think of Hitler, you think of those in China. Millions upon millions of people have been brutally murdered, the Holocaust victims. Uh, how do you wrap your mind around this when you know that there are things that happen like this, and then here, um, how do you explain God's position in all of this? And again, it's beyond the scope of this study here to do that, but they're thoughts we wrestle with, even in today's culture, our political environment. And you think of over in North Korea, you think of what's going on in Russia, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Canada, what's going on in our country. And, where is God in all of this is the cry for many of us. What's his will, and what's his plan? And, is everyone who says they're called of God, really called of God? Just so many questions. And I think it's interesting that we're studying this because there's so many parallels that can be drawn, and also many warnings that can be sounded. So here we see Daniel speaking to Belshazzar, his son, and said, okay, you saw everything your dad went through and how he was humbled by God, but said, you, his son, saw all of this, but you have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this, and you lifted it up against the Lord of heaven, as they have brought the vessels of his house before you, you and your lords and your consorts and your concubines. You've defiled them by drinking wine in them. You've praised not the true God, but your pagan gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, wood, and stone, which of course do not see, hear, or know, and and the God in whose hand thy breath is. It's just beautiful statement, acknowledging our breath of every person, the king included, down to the lowest servant, are in the hand of God, and all of our ways are seen before him. And he's saying to Belshazzar, you haven't glorified him. And then it was the palm of the hand sent before him from God that this writing was inscribed. And then he goes and reads the writing. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. We will get into that. That's a separate study we're going to dwell on. This is the interpretation. He gives it that God has numbered thy kingdom. Mene, tekel, thou hast been weighed in the balances and art found wanting. And Peres, that thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. What I find very interesting here in verse 29 is that Belshazzar agreed with this. He knew and didn't challenge it. And he clothed Daniel with purple, put a chain of gold around his neck, made proclamation concerning him that he should rule in one of the three of the kingdom. You remember a few verses back where Daniel says, no, I don't want any of this. Don't bother giving it to me. Daniel knew the kingdom was going to be taken. Why is this happening? And then we see in verse 30, that night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. End of chapter 5. Wow, you couldn't get things to be more puzzling here. So let's go back a few steps and see if we can find what was going on. First of all, this writing of what was on the wall. What do the sages have to say? They said the word in the first line consisted of mem, mem, tav. These are the letters of the Aramaic alphabet, and the second was these letters, and it read in a kind of a acrostic or anagram. And so what I wanted to do was just take those letters and put them in place here so you can see what they're talking about, because I thought that kind of fascinating, mainly from the standpoint that Aramaic was the known language of the land. We get the impression that the writing that was on the wall was in Aramaic, so why couldn't anybody interpret this? The Jewish sages say, well, it was done instead of writing it from right to left, which is, you can see my cursor going across here, would start at the right side and go to left. It was written as an anagram, which means the letters were rearranged and put in a little bit of a code. And the sages say it then read from top to bottom. So I have the arrows here showing the top. And here, as it was outlined, you would get the mem, which the noon, and the aleph, which is where you get the mene, and the same letters, mem, noon, aleph, mene, mene, the tav, kuf, and lamed, which is where the tekel comes in. Remembering Hebrew here and Aramaic do not have any vowels in it. You had to know that by experience. And then here is the vav, pe, resh, and then the samic ayin, noon, which is where you get upharsin. So that's how Daniel read it. Okay, that makes somewhat sense, but found another article that helped maybe explain a little bit more. This was written by a teacher that I highly respect. His name is Chaim Ben-Torah. Scroll down to the bottom if you haven't heard of him. He has a website called www.hebrewordstudy.com. I highly recommend you looking into it, maybe even subscribing to his learning channel. I did that for a number of years, and just a wealth of information. He's got a very sensitive heart to the things of God, and he wrote this study that when he looked at the words mene, mene, Tekel Upharsin, he translated it as the party's over. And I find it quite interesting. So he also spoke about that the Aramaic words would have been known. He interpreted them pretty much the same way the Jewish commentators did. But what he brings out here is that the reason to translate it as that the party's over is that this prophecy had occurred earlier, saying that the Medes and the Persians were going to take over the Babylonian kingdom. And the king Belshazzar here, as he explains from his Kimes historical study, was fully aware that the Medes and the Persians were ready to invade. He knew that they were maybe even outside the door. This is evidenced in the last verse of chapter 5, where it says that Belshazzar was killed in the middle of the night. He was assassinated. So he knew there were spies around. He knew the Medes and the Persians were ready to invade. He knew about the prophecy, but instead of turning to God for help, he's saying that the reason for this whole party was to call on the pagan gods in order to try to change the order of the events that were prophesied by the one true God. And so that's why he desecrated the holy vessels of God, saying, okay, I'm going to just try to undo everything. I'm going to step in. I'm going to, try to reverse this prophecy. I'm going to show myself more powerful, and my God's more powerful than the one true God of Daniel. And so he also points out here that everyone in the kingdom, the wise men, knew the prophecy on the wall. They knew what it said, but it's talks about that they were afraid to give the interpretation because it was a no-win situation. If they went and gave the interpretation that the Persians were going to come and kill them before sunup, well, who would want to be promoted to prime minister and be part of that team of management that was going to be executed? And if they said something different, they were going to probably lose their heads for giving a positive spin on the king situation, and knew that this wasn't going to come to play and they were going to lose their heads because they gave the wrong interpretation. So it was just a no-win situation. And I thought that was really, really interesting, to find them in that spot, that so they just played dumb and they didn't interpret it. But Daniel, knowing that God was going to protect him, knowing that God was anointing him, came and gave him the explanation about what would happen. Okay, that talks about the dream. What it still doesn't talk about is why Daniel allowed the decoration of being uh, put on with the chain of gold, and the um, garment of purple, and why did he not suffer the same fate that probably the others in the kingdom were going to suffer, who were in management, who were in ruling, and that Belteshazzar was slain. Who else was slain? How did these guys get in? There had to be an inside job of his trusted advisors, someone getting into his chamber at night, getting past the guards because they had bodyguards there, and or were the bodyguards part of this, and the whole thing, came down, um, and with an inside job. So that's where we leave today's study. Very intriguing, very interesting. The sages don't say anything about what's going on here. They talk about Daniel being rewarded, but they don't talk about why he rejected it and said he didn't want it, but then um, ultimately took it upon himself. So we're going to have to look and see, when we get to the next chapter, which ironically talks about Daniel in the lion's den. A little bit of spoiler alert here, but we're going to be looking for, well, what happened now that the Babylonians are not in command, and it looks like the Medes and the Persians are going to be in charge, how do things change for Daniel? What about his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do we hear anything about them anymore? Why does the story change so quickly? And what are we really supposed to learn here? So, this takeaway here is about humility. It's about seeing the hand of God. It's about when kingdoms change, when powers change, there's really only one right solution, and that is to maintain humility. And that is to recognize that God is in control, no matter how things look different to us, no matter how things look like we think they shouldn't be, or if they do look like we think they should be, realizing that we may not have the right viewpoint. You know, challenging myself through all of this, and of course, now I'm jumping to current events, is saying, what is my viewpoint really supposed to be? How do I stay what I like to call kingdom minded, meaning God's kingdom? What is his purpose and plan? How does this fit in with what we read about in the book of Revelation? I know there are prophets out there who are making their predictions, but for every prediction, there's at least three or four different interpretations. And, which one do I listen to? How do I know uh, how things go? Again, I can only come back to this verse 22 as Daniel admonished to humble our hearts and see what's going on, take it from a position of humility, of allowing God to be God, and I want to be his servant. I want to follow him humbly. I want to follow his direction. I want to try hear his voice and understand his direction in all the noise that's going on, and how can I follow him faithfully. So that's what I get out of we'll say the moral of the story today. And I just want to share that with you as we go through these very challenging times, knowing that Daniel went through challenging times. Uh, all types of kingdoms, as I say, like to think, and nations, the Jewish people have gone through challenging times for centuries and eons. And are we any different now, or is this is pretty much the same? And is the message still the same, to humble ourselves before God and listen to His voice, and to not act rashly, not act quickly, but to wait and see what God will do. So God bless you all. Thanks so much for this little story and all my added commentary. And Lord so willing, we'll be in touch next week. Bye bye.